I'm delighted to have as my guest today Erica Barnett, who is the founder and editor of The C is for Crank, a great local blog here in Seattle that really is about the power structure in many ways and who runs this town. And so, Erica, welcome, first of all.
Thank you.
I want to start with that general question. From your perspective as a journalist, as an advocate, as a citizen who's been involved in so many public issues over the years, what's your take on the power structure and who runs this town?
Well, I think it's a lot of different people. I don't think that that the city is run top down by businesses, as some people suggest, or big developers, or the mayor's office. I think it's a combination. I mean, I think there's certainly the city power structure, but there's certainly developers who give contributions to local politicians and so forth. But I think one thing that's kind of unique about Seattle is that the neighborhoods also have a lot of power. And that is a long story that starts back in the 90s or even before. But what it boils down to is that that individual neighborhood groups sort of structurally have a lot of power in terms of city decision making, and I think we've seen that recently in the debate over the mayor's housing affordability and livability agenda, which is basically a plan to densify different parts of the city, add more housing, add more affordable housing, that has been really controversial and has gotten a lot of pushback from some of the traditional neighborhood power structure.
So this halle plan, as it's called, has activated a lot of these neighborhood groups. When you talk about neighborhood organizations, go one level deeper. What do you mean? Are they community councils? Are they informal kind of ad hoc networks of people who come together? Like, what are you talking about?
There's so many, but there's a particular structure where you have community councils, and then above that you have neighborhood district councils, and I think there's, I'm going to get the number wrong, but somewhere north of a dozen of those. And then below both of those, you have these sort of, little community groups like Sustainable Ballard, say, or, or condo organizations. And those all sort of filter up. But so it is kind of a ground up process of becoming, part of that larger power structure. But ultimately, there is a formal structure in place where neighborhood district councils advise the city and have some power over what the city actually does. And that structure is sort of being challenged right now. The neighborhood district councils were recently, as you probably heard,
as I read on The C is for Crank.
That's right. They had some of their power removed in that the city's not going to have a formal relationship with them anymore. Because there is a power dynamic between those traditional neighborhood groups and the people who are coming up and saying, we want to say, and that's traditionally people who haven't been included in that power structure, like renters.
Renters. Yeah.
Renters, immigrants, lower income people, who maybe communicate on the internet more than they do through the physical mail, that informs neighbors of meetings and things like that. So there's a changing dynamic there that's happening right now that I think is really exciting and really interesting to watch.
So that's fascinating. I mean, just within the set of conduits that are at the neighborhood level, you have that flux and that contest. But you were alluding earlier to as between neighborhood groups and the city, or between neighborhood groups and developers, another layer of contest. How has this been playing out in halle, for instance, the power structure dynamics?
Well, I think that neighborhood groups sort of feel like the developers have had all this power and say in halle because it is a density-driven plan, and so they're sort of doing what neighborhood groups often do, which is protesting and saying we want things to be a different way. We don't want so much growth. We've already accepted enough growth. But what's happening, off to the side is that you also have a lot of people saying, wait a minute, we really support halle. And there's a coalition that's been built in support of this plan that is really unprecedented in Seattle history, where you have not just developers, the traditional supporters of development, but you have renters and you have social justice groups and environmental groups all coming together. And a lot of times those folks are not all on the same page.
But they see a convergence of affordability, sustainability, and density.
Right.
And so all their interests align there.
Right. And, and so I think, the most extraordinary thing was seeing groups like Puget Sound Sage come on board with developers who are traditionally their enemies. Puget Sound Sage is a liberal social justice group. But, I think that through conversations with the environmentalists in the neighborhood, the, sort of pro-density neighborhood people, they realized that in this case, their interests aligned.
So one of the things we talked about earlier in our lesson was about one of the conduits of power being just narrative, kind of ideology, right? And on a topic like development, one of the narratives that's out there is this narrative that sometimes gets shorthanded as NIMBY or NIMBYism, right? Another narrative is much more about kind of sustainability, whatever, right? These contest stories that either you're trying to tell about yourself or you're trying to put the other guy in a box with, right? At this level of kind of narrative and ideology, what are the big storyline fights right now in Seattle?
Well, I think that it will always be, quote unquote NIMBYs versus, the people who are sort of trying to push their way in. So I think that is kind of a classic clash where you have people who are maybe single family homeowners who moved here, decades ago to raise a family.
But they resist and reject the label of NIMBY in the first place, right? Because it has such a sort of negative connotation.
It has a toxic connotation. And so, if you take it literally, it's just not in my backyard, right? So, that is literally what they're saying, but it has a toxic connotation, and I totally understand why they would reject that. But I think the narrative that the other side is sort of, if they're going to be successful and they're going to push this halle plan through, and have it be mostly accepted, I think the narrative that's most compelling to me is inclusion, because it's not, we want to impose these, boxes of ugly townhomes on you, because nobody wants that. And instead turning it into a narrative of, we want to be part of this neighborhood too. And we want to have a say because we consider this our neighborhood too. And yeah, as a renter, I certainly have felt that way. I've lived in Seattle for 15 years. And, and I stubbornly cling to the notion that I, should be able to live here. And despite the fact that I can't afford to buy a house, and I'm very invested in my neighborhood.
Last question I want to pose to you in the brief time we have left is just about your role. First of all, are you part of the power structure as a journalist, as a blogger, and if so, how does that manifest itself?
Well, I think by virtue of the fact that I've been around for a little while now, I am part of that power structure. But I would say that as a small blogger, it's I'm a very small and shrinking part of that in a way. I mean, sadly, the media since I've been here has really contracted, and I think proportionally, the power that small bloggers like myself and like Publicola and maybe Crosscut and other people, sort of at the level that I'm at online, are a shrinking proportion of the power, and more of the media's power is being concentrated in the hands of the Seattle Times. We haven't had the PI for the most part for several years now. And so I think that they have an outsized influence on decision makers. I mean, you see this there was a column by Danny Westneat that freaked everybody out a while back about they're going to take all your single family zoning and houses away. And that ended up influencing city policy in a really concrete way and very quickly. So the media structure continues to shift, and I think it will continue to do so.
Well, it's part and parcel of the larger dynamic in this town and in this country right now, where a lot of power is concentrating into fewer hands, and the work of bloggers and activists and others is about really trying to circulate and disperse that in new ways that either change the power structure or bust out of it in different ways. So, Erica, thank you so much for joining us today. Erica Barnett's website is called thecisforcrank.com.
Correct.
A wonderful blog about power in the city, about contests not only over housing and affordability, but all manner of public issues. And Erica, thanks so much for this conversation.
Thank you, Eric.